Hello and welcome to the Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. The 2025 NATO Summit will be held at the World Forum in The Hague from the 24th to 26th of June. Among the topics of discussion will be defense spending, strengthening the alliance, support for Ukraine, and bolstering defense capabilities. With the summit fast approaching, how might European powers fill the leadership and aid vacuum left by the U.S. as the Trump administration's appetite for foreign conflicts dissipates? Here to share his insights on what to watch out for leading up to and coming out of the summit is historian and author Max Boot, Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining me, Max.
Good to be with you.
First, give us a very brief history of NATO, how it came to be, and its overall aims.
Well, NATO was created in the late 1940s as a way for the United States and Canada to work together with our European allies to counter the Soviet threat to Western Europe. And it's become the most successful alliance in world history. It's still together after all those years, and it has been throughout its history the linchpin of security and stability in Europe. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO expanded to the east to take in the newly liberated former Soviet satellite states and republics, including the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and others. And it has played a massive role in stabilizing that part of Europe and preventing Russian aggression. I think it's very significant, for example, that Vladimir Putin is attacking Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, but he is not attacking the Baltic republics or Poland, which are members of NATO. I think that's a demonstration of the importance of NATO and the deterrent effect that it has in action.
Max, are we seeing a return to the United States pre-World War II diplomatic isolationism? What's the historical significance of President Donald Trump's threatening to change the U.S.'s participation in NATO?
Well, it's very concerning to see a U.S. president who labels his foreign policy America first, because, of course, that was the label used by Charles Lindbergh and other isolationists in the pre-World War II period, and their philosophy was completely repudiated and discredited by the outbreak of World War II. In similar fashion, by the way, President Trump is not only the most unilateralist or isolationist U.S. president since the 1930s. He's also the most protectionist. And the Greatest Generation saw the consequences not only of isolationism, but also of protectionism, because protectionism, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, was widely seen as one of the influences that made the Great Depression as devastating as it was and helped to lead the world to war. And so after World War II, the Greatest Generation in the United States and our European allies vowed never again. And they instituted policies of pursuing security alliances like NATO, of pursuing free trade, of trying to promote and defend liberal democratic institutions around the world, all in order to avoid the outbreak of World War III. And those policies have been stunningly successful in keeping the peace and expanding the global sphere of prosperity and democracy. And now all of those basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy for more than 70 years are under assault by President Trump, who doesn't seem to believe in any of those ideas that have served America so well for so long.
During an ABC News interview with President Trump's envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, he said that Russia's concern over the eastern enlargement of NATO was fair. He also reiterated that the U.S. does not support Ukraine's entry into the alliance. Is this now a moot point heading into the summit? And is the U.S. the lone holdout?
It is a moot point. NATO is certainly not going to extend an invitation to Ukraine at this summit or any summit anytime soon. And it's not, on this issue, the U.S. is not the lone holdout. Germany, among others, has also been very reluctant. And this is not just the Trump administration. This is, in fairness, also the Biden administration was also not eager to extend NATO membership to Ukraine. That's not a crazy position because, obviously, if NATO were to extend an invitation to Ukraine right now, there's a real concern that NATO would become embroiled in a war against Russia. But there's a lot that the European countries and the United States can still do to help Ukraine without the NATO membership, including helping Ukraine to become a member of the European Union, and also ensuring that the pipeline of weaponry from the United States to Ukraine continues. That pipeline is almost dry right now. But one point I would make about NATO, and I think very important to keep in mind, Vladimir Putin has used the boogeyman of Ukraine and NATO as an excuse for his unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And that is, to quote a previous US president, that is just malarkey, because it's been evident that Ukraine was never going to join NATO anytime soon. And NATO is, in any case, a defensive alliance. It's not a threat against Russia. And by the way, if Putin's primary concern is to avoid the expansion of NATO, his invasion of Ukraine had the opposite consequence, because it led Finland and Sweden to join NATO, which they had not done in the past, but now they have done because they are so afraid of Russian aggression. So that rationale that the Kremlin has advanced for its war against Ukraine doesn't hold up to any scrutiny, in part because everybody knows, and everybody knew even before the invasion, that Ukraine was not going to be admitted to NATO anytime soon.
Leading up to the NATO summit were peace talks that took place in Turkey on June 2nd. As of this recording, Russia is still refusing to back down on its demands that Ukraine give up large swaths of territory and agree to limit the size of its army. This is according to a memo reported by Russian media. What might move the needle in this negotiation?
That's a great question, because clearly at this point, Putin has no interest in negotiating. President Zelensky and Ukraine have agreed to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire as demanded by President Trump. Putin has consistently rejected that demand and made clear that his war of aggression will continue until Russia achieves its war aims, which include annexing a large chunk of Ukrainian territory, changing regimes in Kiev, putting limits on the Ukrainian armed forces, and basically turning Ukraine into a quasi-colony of the Kremlin. And those are all conditions that Ukraine will fight to the death in order not to agree to. So clearly, as long as Putin sticks to those hardline demands, negotiations over a peace settlement are not going to go anywhere. And so far, they haven't gone anywhere. In terms of your question, which is, I think, the right one to ask, what could possibly move the needle? I think it's sending clear signals that Putin will not be able to defeat Ukraine, that he will not win this war. Because right now he thinks he can still advance. He thinks that Trump will cut off Ukraine. He thinks that the Russian armed forces can still make major gains. I think it's imperative to signal to Russia that there is no battlefield solution for Russia here, that there is no way they will achieve their battlefield objectives. And how do we do that? Well, there are several ways of doing it. One way, at the moment, the European countries have about $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. They should turn those over to Ukraine immediately, so Ukraine can use that money to finance its own arms industry and build the weapons it needs to defend itself indefinitely. The U.S. should also give or sell weapons to Ukraine and crack down on sanctions on Russia as called for in a Senate bill. All of these things combined together would send a very clear message to Putin. You're not going to win this war. You have to compromise. You have to negotiate in earnest. But so far, that message has not gone out. President Trump has said several times over the last couple of months that he's unhappy about Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian civilians, but he is not backing up those words with actions. And unless we do something to increase the cost to Russia of its aggression, that aggression will continue.
President Trump promised, of course, to end the war in Ukraine on his first day in office. After initially siding with Russia, Trump recently expressed his frustrations, as you said, saying Putin has gone, quote, absolutely crazy, unquote, with his massive ongoing military strikes against Ukraine. What's been the effect of Trump's mixed messages regarding Putin on our relationship with our NATO allies?
I think this is very worrisome for our NATO allies, because they want the U.S. to take a tough line against Russian aggression, as we were doing under President Biden. So they're very concerned about the mixed signals from Washington, and those mixed signals undercut any impetus for ending the war. I mean, if you want to talk about why Trump hasn't had any success in peacemaking, even though he promised that he would end the war in a day, a lot of the reason why he's not being more successful is he's not doing anything to put pressure on Russia. He's sending signals to the Kremlin that he is more interested in doing business with Russia than he is in forcing Russia to end its war of aggression. And so, as long as that continues, it will be very hard to bring this war to a close. But this is definitely a huge transatlantic divide because our European allies see this Russian invasion of Ukraine as an existential threat to themselves. They are very, very worried that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, Putin will continue moving further west, that the Baltic republics or Poland, which are both NATO members, could be next. And an attack on those countries could trigger a massive global war. So the European countries want to hold the line against Russian aggression in Ukraine. And Trump seems to be at best ambivalent in terms of the war. And having the U.S. and Europe at cross purposes, the only person that helps is Vladimir Putin.
I want to turn now to the funding of NATO. President Trump has pushed for NATO members to pay their, quote, fair share, 2% of each nation's GDP on NATO defense. How have other nations responded so far?
Well, actually, most NATO countries are now spending at least 2% of GDP on defense, but Trump is moving the goalposts. He's now demanding that NATO countries spend 5% of GDP on defense, which, by the way, is more than the US itself spends. We spend about 3.5% of GDP on defense. So I don't think this is a realistic demand, but I think the European countries are recognizing that even 2% is insufficient, and they're, I think, going to set 3% or 3.5% as a benchmark for their defense spending. And then they're going to do some creative accounting and claim that they're getting up to 5% by counting infrastructure investment as part of their quote unquote national defense budget. But I think clearly there is a recognition in Europe that they need to spend more on defense. They are spending more on defense. And the fact that we now have a government in Germany that is willing to do deficit spending, which is willing to take on debt in order to expand its defense budget, that's a big deal. That's a huge amount of money potentially that Germany is going to be able to pour into its defense budget. It's going to vastly enhance European defense capabilities. We see the UK just came out with a defense white paper that calls for an expansion of the British military and British defense spending. I think this is pretty universal across Europe. All these countries recognize that there is a threat, but it's going to take them a while to scale up spending. And I think the primary impetus is not so much President Trump's browbeating; it's the threat that they see from Putin, and they're concerned that they're going to be abandoned by the United States, so they're going to have to fend for themselves.
In terms of the U.S. remaining in NATO, some Americans may be joining Trump and asking, what's in it for us? So, what's in it for us?
Well, what's in it for us is a more prosperous, stable, and mutually beneficial world order. I mean, Europe is one of our largest trade partners. It's a massive continent of 350 million people. We do a tremendous amount of business with them. We share common values with them. These are all liberal democracies. So it's imperative that we stand with our allies, as we have done since 1945, to ensure peace and stability in Europe. The alternative is too horrific to contemplate. We're already getting a small taste of it in Ukraine with the most serious war of aggression that Europe has seen since 1945. We don't want to see the rest of the continent becoming embroiled in war. And the most effective way to avoid conflict is to deter aggressors. And nothing deters aggression more than NATO. We've seen that over more than 70 years. NATO has kept the peace. That's very much to America's benefit as well as to Europe's benefit, and indeed the entire world's benefit.
And finally, Max, as I mentioned, this year's summit will be held in The Hague, a city synonymous with international justice. What's at stake with this year's talks?
Well, I think there's a lot at stake. We've talked about the divisions between the U.S. and Europe on how to deal with Ukraine. There are also, although this is not a NATO issue per se, the fact that President Trump has declared trade wars on our allies is also something that strains ties. and makes it harder for us to cooperate on defense and strategic matters when we're at war with each other on tariffs. And again, this is not going to be something that's going to be resolved at the NATO summit, but I think it is imperative for the Trump administration to back off its tariff threats and to reach accommodations with our European allies. I think there's a general sense that what's at stake is the future of the transatlantic alliance. Do we have enough in common anymore between the U.S. and Europe to keep this alliance together? And I would emphatically argue yes, but nobody knows if Trump is convinced of that, because in the past and even now, he's been much more critical of U.S. allies than he has been of U.S. enemies. He continues to denounce the Europeans as freeloaders and people who are taking advantage of us. None of that is true, but it puts a massive strain on the alliance, and I think there will be an opportunity to try to heal some of that strain at the NATO summit.
Max, thank you so much for being on the Excerpt.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.